I wanted to conclude, these are the three primary modes of attack. I wanted to conclude by giving some examples, some lengthy examples. We only have 10 minutes, I'll try to summarize them. The first example, and by the way, I've given three tactics. I'm not being exclusive. These are the primary three tactics. Also, most of the time, an attack against the honor of our Prophet ﷺ is a combination of these three. It's not that only one is used. A story is invented, bits of fabrication, bits of distorted truths, bits of cultural values, and then presented. And so an example of this, one example, in a little bit of detail. The story of Zaynab Bint Jahsh and the Prophet ﷺ's marriage to Zaynab. Now, Zaynab Bint Jahsh was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was married to Zayd. And Zayd, radiallahu anhu, was the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. As you all know, he had adopted Zayd. And so he was called Zayd ibn Muhammad. And just like in our culture, American culture, adopted children and biological children are considered the same. Morally, I'm saying. Morally. If you try to say, no, there's a difference, morally society will say, oh, you're being so mean, you're being so unfair. Cultural values, once again. Islamically, in the beginning period of Islam, it was the same. Adopted children, biological children are the same. And so when the Prophet ﷺ adopted Zayd, his name became Zayd ibn Muhammad. And the wife of Zayd, i.e. Zaynab, became the daughter-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ. And as you all know, daughter-in-laws are permanent mahram. Even if the marriage breaks between the son and the wife, the father-in-law always remains a mahram. This is a strange thing, subhanAllah. The husband becomes a non-mahram after the divorce. The husband becomes a non-mahram because after the divorce is over. But the father-in-law remains a mahram forever. So, in this case, when Zayd and Zaynab were married, the Prophet ﷺ eventually ended up marrying Zaynab. What is the Orientalist version? The Orientalists all agree. There is pretty much ijma', unanimous consensus amongst them, that the version of events goes as follows. The Prophet ﷺ allegedly fell in love with Zaynab. He went to visit her in her house, and she opened the door, and she was wearing clothes that typically she would wear when she's sleeping. In other words, not fully dressed up. And that the Prophet ﷺ saw her beauty and was impressed by that and fell in love with her. And when Zayd heard about this, then he divorced his wife so that the Prophet ﷺ could marry her. And Allah Azza wa Jal conveniently revealed, according to them, verses that talk about adopted children are not real children and you can marry their wives. This is the non-Muslim version of events. That the Prophet ﷺ, a'udhu billah, saw Zaynab dressed inappropriately, fell in love with her at first sight, and wanted to marry her. So he concocted these verses to say that adopted children are not biological children. The problem with this sequence of events is that it is presented as undisputed fact from within the Islamic tradition. It's as if this is the only version of events. Yet the fact of the matter is that this version is only one version of the story. And let us call this, for lack of a better term, the love story version. There are other versions that exist in classical and medieval texts which are generally considered more acceptable and more authentic. In fact, Sahih al-Bukhari, Tafsir ibn Kathir, or the Sirah ibn Ishaq, all of the standard references present a very different picture. Before we get into who's right and wrong, don't you think it's hypocritical for a non-Muslim to come and pounce on the most sensationalist story and ignore all the other versions and then not even tell you the other versions exist? Not even question the fact that there are other versions of the story? Let me give you, for example, the earliest tafsirs written, Tafsir of Abdul Razak in 211, Tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim in 327, the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, the earliest Seerah books written, Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, the earliest Hadith books written, the Hadith of the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. All of these books give a radically different story. What is the story there? The story there is that the Prophet ﷺ was informed by Allah that eventually Zaynab would be his wife. And Zayd and Zaynab began having arguments and disputes. Zayd did not want to remain married to Zaynab. So Zayd came to the Prophet ﷺ wanting a divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ felt awkward because he knew that when that divorce takes place and the iddah is over, Zaynab would become his wife, and he himself did not like the cultural taboo of marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he told Zayd, ittaqillah, fear Allah and don't divorce her. He told Zayd not to divorce her, and he feared men's criticism of this cultural taboo. Not that he had love of Zaynab. Rather, he was embarrassed at marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he wanted to stall it. Zayd wanted a divorce. This is the version of Sahih Bukhari. And the Prophet says, no, you stay with her. Don't divorce her. And Allah Azza wa Jal then revealed verses in Surah Ahzab. Why were you scared of the people? The Prophet says, this is a verse in the Quran. Why were you scared of the people? وَتَخْشَى النَّاسِ. It is more befitting that you are scared of Allah. Shouldn't be embarrassed at the people's statements. There is no love story in Sahih Bukhari, in Ibn Kathir, and all of these books. The question arises, where does this love story exist? Response, again we're getting a little bit academic here, but it exists in a tafsir called Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. And Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, by unanimous consensus, is not a scholar. He's not a historian. He is a storyteller. He is a storyteller. In other words, he's a tabloid paper. He's not the New York Times. Literally, he's a tabloid paper. So the Orientalists, imagine, and I said this at an academic conference when I was defending the story in a certain context. I said, imagine walking into a bookstore, walking into a supermarket, and ignoring the New York Times, ignoring, the Washington Post, ignoring every single reputable, the Times Magazine, Newsweek, and getting your news from the Daily Inquirer, for example. This is the equivalent of what these people are doing. They ignore every single authentic, legitimate book, and they go to the most obscure references. How many of you have even heard of Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman? Yes, it exists. It's not a fabrication. Meaning the book is not a fabrication. What's inside it might be. But the book itself, it exists. How many of you are aware of it? Nobody. But these guys hunt down these stories, extract them, and popularize them. So this is one example. There are many other examples as well, which we don't have time to get into.